Moving to Cactus Ridge Estates felt like stepping into a postcard at first. The desert stretched endlessly, dotted with saguaro cacti and rugged hills painted in shades of gold and red under the blazing sun. It was peaceful, quiet, and exactly what I needed after years of city life. But little did I know, this serene landscape came with its own set of challenges, and some very strange rules. From the moment I unpacked my boxes, I noticed something odd about the neighborhood. Everyone seemed friendly enough, waving hello as they passed by in their golf carts or SUVs, but there was an underlying tension that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way people whispered when talking about the HOA, the homeowners association, or how everyone's yards looked eerily similar, like cookie-cutter versions of each other. Even the cacti lining the driveways appeared perfectly spaced, as if measured with a ruler. Then came the welcome packet. It wasn't just a few pages outlining basic guidelines. It was a massive binder filled with rules thicker than a novel. At first glance, most of them seemed harmless. No parking RVs on the street, no loud music after 10 p.m., and restrictions on holiday decorations. Fair enough, I thought. These were standard for any suburban community. But one rule caught my attention immediately. All lawns must be maintained at a height no greater than 2 inches. 2 inches? In the middle of a desert? I flipped through the pages again, half expecting to find a punchline. Surely, this had to be a joke. My yard wasn't even close to resembling a traditional lawn. Instead of green grass, it was mostly dirt, rocks, and the occasional patch of stubborn weeds struggling to survive the relentless heat. How could anyone expect me to trim something that barely existed? Still, I decided not to overthink it. Maybe the rule didn't apply to homes like mine. After all, maintaining a lush lawn in this climate would require gallons of water daily, a luxury we simply couldn't afford in such an arid region. Besides, who would notice? Most of my neighbors probably hadn't paid much attention to my property anyway. But then, about a week later, reality hit hard. I was sitting on my porch, sipping iced tea, and watching the sunset paint the horizon orange, when I heard a knock at the door. Standing there was a man in khakis so crisp they could cut glass. He introduced himself as Greg, the HOA's lawn inspector. His clipboard practically screamed authority, and his smile was polite but distant, like he was trying too hard to appear approachable. "Hi, Miss Carter," he said, glancing down at his notes. "Just wanted to remind you that your lawn is a bit unruly." I blinked at him, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Unruly. That word didn't belong in a place where tumbleweeds rolled freely and jackrabbits outnumbered humans. "What do you mean?" I asked, gesturing toward my barren yard. "There's hardly anything growing out here." Greg tilted his head slightly, as if considering my point, but his expression remained firm. "The grass," he replied, pointing vaguely toward my property. "It's overgrown. You'll need to trim it down to regulation length within 7 days, or we'll have to issue a fine." My jaw dropped. Overgrown. Fine. For what? A handful of desert weeds. I wanted to argue, to explain how ridiculous this whole situation was, but Greg didn't give me a chance. With a curt nod, he turned and walked back to his golf cart, leaving me standing there, utterly baffled. As I watched him drive away, I realized something unsettling. This wasn't going to be the carefree desert escape I'd imagined. There were forces at play here, forces determined to impose order on chaos, even if it made no sense. And somehow, I'd become their latest target. The encounter with Greg left me feeling uneasy, like I'd accidentally stepped into a game where the rules were written in invisible ink. I spent the rest of the evening pacing my living room, replaying his words in my head. Overgrown grass. Really, my yard looked more like a moonscape than a suburban lawn. How could anyone take that seriously? Still, I decided to play it safe. Maybe Greg was just doing his job. And if I ignored him, the whole thing would blow over. After all, how much trouble could a few stray weeds cause? Surely, no one would actually fine me for something so absurd. But as the days passed, I started noticing things, small details about my neighbors that made me question whether I truly understood this place. Every morning, without fail, Mr. Henderson from across the street would march out in his wide-brimmed hat and meticulously sweep his driveway, even though there wasn't a speck of dirt to be seen. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived 2 doors down, watered her cactus garden at precisely 6:15 a.m., not a minute earlier or later. And then there was the way people avoided eye contact when they walked past my house, as if looking directly at it might somehow get them in trouble. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to dig deeper. One afternoon, while taking a walk around the block, I struck up a conversation with Betty, an older woman who always seemed to have a cup of coffee in hand. She was friendly enough, though her sharp eyes hinted at a mind constantly observing everything around her. "So," I began casually, "how do you feel about the HOA's grass policy?" Betty paused mid-sip, her eyebrows shooting up. "Oh, honey," she said, lowering her voice as if someone might overhear us. "That's just the tip of the iceberg." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She glanced around before leaning in closer. "It's not about the grass, or the driveways, or the mailboxes, or whatever else they come up with next. It's about control. They want everyone to follow their rules, no matter how ridiculous they are. If you step out of line, they'll make your life miserable." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "You're kidding, right? It's just a neighborhood association." Betty shook her head, her expression grim. "Take Mr. Peterson, for example. Last year, he tried to install solar panels on his roof. Totally eco-friendly, right? But the HOA fined him $500 because they said the panels didn't match the aesthetic of the community. Said they were visually disruptive." My mouth fell open. "That's insane. Who decides what's visually disruptive?" "Marcia does," Betty replied, rolling her eyes. "She's the president of the HOA. Thinks she's running a 5-star resort instead of a bunch of houses in the middle of nowhere." As I listened to Betty's stories, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The overly manicured yards, the hushed conversations, the strange uniformity. It all made sense now. This wasn't just about keeping properties tidy. It was about maintaining power. The HOA had created a system where compliance wasn't optional. It was mandatory. And if you dared to challenge them, you risked becoming public enemy number 1. By the time I returned home, my head was spinning. Was I ready to fight this battle? Or should I just cut my losses and buy a pair of gardening shears, even if it meant pretending to mow air? As I stared out at my rocky, barren yard, I realized I had a decision to make. Stand up for myself, or let them push me around. And deep down, I knew which choice I wanted to make. The more I thought about Betty's warning, the angrier I became. How could a group of people, who were supposed to represent the neighborhood, turn something as simple as grass into a battleground? It wasn't just unfair, it was ridiculous. My yard wasn't overgrown, it was desert. If anything, I was doing everyone a favor by not wasting precious water trying to grow something that clearly didn't belong here. But anger alone wouldn't solve my problem. I needed to figure out how far this so-called grass policy went and whether anyone else felt the same way I did. Over the next few days, I made it a point to talk to more of my neighbors. Some were hesitant to speak up, glancing nervously over their shoulders as if Marcia might appear out of nowhere. Others, however, opened up, especially once they realized I wasn't afraid to question the rules. Take Tom, for instance. He lived a few houses down and always seemed like the gruff, no-nonsense type. When I approached him one evening while he was tinkering with his truck, he gave me a wary look at first. But after I mentioned the grass issue, his expression softened, and he let out a bitter laugh. "They fined me last summer," he said, shaking his head, "for having a dead patch in my front yard. Never mind that we hadn't seen rain in months. They told me I had to reseed it or pay $300. "Did you?" I asked, incredulous. "Nope," he replied, crossing his arms. "I paid the fine because I didn't want the hassle. But trust me, it left a bad taste in my mouth. These people don't care about fairness. They care about control. His words stuck with me long after our conversation ended. Control. That's what this was really about. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were sending a message. Fall in line or face the consequences. And judging by the stories I was hearing, those consequences weren't pretty. Still, not everyone was willing to stay silent. Sarah, a young mom with 2 kids, confided in me during a casual chat outside her house. She admitted she'd been frustrated for years, but never knew how to push back without risking backlash. "It feels like walking on eggshells," she said. "You're scared to even sneeze too loudly, in case it violates some obscure rule." As I gathered these stories, a plan began forming in my mind. Maybe I couldn't fight the HOA alone, but together we might stand a chance. If enough of us spoke up, surely they'd have to listen. Or at least, that's what I hoped. To strengthen our case, I decided to do some research. Late one night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, typing keywords like HOA disputes and grass regulations in deserts. What I found was both surprising and infuriating. Several states, including Arizona, had laws protecting homeowners from unreasonable HOA policies, especially when it came to environmental concerns. Water conservation was a big deal here, and forcing residents to maintain non-native grass went against every principle of sustainability. Armed with this information, I drafted a letter to the HOA board. It wasn't confrontational, just a polite explanation of why their grass-cutting mandate made no sense in a desert environment. I included references to local regulations and politely requested clarification on how they expected me to comply. Then I sent it off, hoping for the best. What I didn't expect was their response. A week later, an official notice arrived in my mailbox. A formal warning stating that I owed $250 for failing to trim my overgrown lawn. Apparently, explaining the lack of actual grass wasn't going to cut it. My stomach churned as I read the letter. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for common sense. And I knew exactly where to start. Rallying the neighbors who felt the same way. Together, we'd show the HOA that their iron grip wasn't as unbreakable as they thought. The official notice from the HOA hit me like a punch to the gut. A $250 fine for not cutting grass that didn't exist. It was absurd, infuriating, and completely unreasonable. But as much as I wanted to crumple up the letter and toss it in the trash, I knew ignoring it wouldn't solve anything. If anything, it would only give them more ammunition to come after me. No, I had to fight back, and I had to do it smartly. That's when I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. I'd avoided these gatherings before, assuming they'd be boring discussions about mailbox colors or holiday decorations. But now, with a target on my back, I needed to see how this organization operated firsthand. Plus, showing up might send a message. I wasn't backing down. The meeting took place in the community center, a bland beige building with fluorescent lights and rows of folding chairs. As I walked in, I felt dozens of eyes on me, some curious, others wary. Marcia, the HOA president, sat at the front of the room behind a long table, flanked by Greg and 2 other board members. She looked every bit the part of someone used to being in charge. Sharp blazer, perfectly styled hair, and a clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. After a few routine announcements about upcoming events and maintenance schedules, Marcia finally addressed the elephant in the room. "We have a matter concerning Miss Carter," she announced, her tone clipped. "She has failed to comply with our lawn maintenance policy, despite multiple reminders." I stood up before she could say another word. All eyes turned to me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Taking a deep breath, I began speaking. "Marcia," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I understand the HOA wants to keep the neighborhood looking nice, but let's be realistic here. My yard isn't a traditional lawn. It's desert. There's hardly any grass to cut. So tell me, exactly what am I supposed to trim?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement. Others stared at their laps, unwilling to make eye contact. Marcia, however, didn't miss a beat. "The rules are clear, Miss Carter," she replied coolly. "If you own property in this community, you're required to maintain your yard according to our standards. Failure to do so reflects poorly on all of us." Her words stung, but I refused to back down. With all due respect, those standards don't make sense in this environment. We live in a desert. Forcing people to grow grass or pretend to care for it is wasteful and impractical. Not to mention, it goes against state laws encouraging water conservation. Marcia's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might actually listen. Instead, she leaned forward, her expression hardening. "This isn't about water conservation. It's about maintaining property values. If everyone did whatever they pleased, this neighborhood would lose its appeal." Her response left me speechless for a second. Then I gestured toward the window, where the vast expanse of dry land stretched beyond the subdivision. "Property values. Really? Look outside. This is a desert. People move here because they love the natural beauty, not because they want fake green lawns. Why can't we embrace that instead of fighting it?" The room fell silent. Even Marcia seemed taken aback by my outburst. But just as I thought I might have struck a chord, Greg chimed in, his tone patronizing. "Miss Carter, perhaps you should consider xeriscaping if you're so passionate about desert landscapes. However, until then, the rules still apply." Xeriscaping. The irony wasn't lost on me. That's exactly what my yard already resembled. A natural, low-maintenance landscape. But arguing further felt pointless. Marcia clearly wasn't interested in compromise. Her mind was made up, and no amount of logic or reason was going to change it. As I sat back down, frustration bubbling inside me, I realized something important. This wasn't just my fight anymore. The murmurs around the room told me others were starting to question the HOA's authority too. And if I played my cards right, maybe, just maybe, I could turn this personal battle into something bigger, something that could shake the foundation of Marcia's carefully controlled world. The HOA meeting ended with a sour taste in my mouth, but it also lit a fire under me. Marcia's refusal to listen wasn't just frustrating. It was galvanizing. I realized that if I wanted to make any real change, I couldn't do it alone. This wasn't just about my yard anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had been bullied into silence by the HOA's unreasonable rules. That evening, I invited Betty, Tom, Sarah, and a few other neighbors over for coffee. We gathered in my living room, sitting on mismatched chairs and couches while I laid out my plan. "We need to show them we're not going to back down," I said, passing around copies of the petition I drafted. "If enough of us speak up, they'll have no choice but to listen." The petition outlined why the grass-cutting policy was impractical and environmentally irresponsible. It included references to state laws supporting water conservation and arguments for embracing desert-friendly landscaping. By the end of the night, everyone in the room had signed it, and they promised to help gather more signatures from other neighbors. Over the next week, we worked tirelessly. Betty took charge of canvassing the east side of the neighborhood, armed with her clipboard and an unshakable determination. Tom, ever the tough guy, tackled the west side, using his gruff charm to win people over. Sarah focused on the younger families, many of whom were eager to support anything that could save them time and money on yard maintenance. As for me, I stayed close to home, answering questions and addressing concerns from hesitant residents. Not everyone was willing to sign right away. Some worried about retaliation from the HOA, fines, inspections, or even social ostracism. Others simply didn't want to rock the boat. But for every reluctant neighbor, there was another who nodded vigorously, saying things like, "Finally, someone's speaking up," or, "I've hated this rule since day one." By the time we submitted the petition to the HOA board, it had nearly 50 signatures, a significant portion of the community. Alongside the petition, I included a formal request for an emergency meeting to discuss revising the grass-cutting policy. To my surprise, the board agreed to meet with us the following Saturday. On the morning of the meeting, nerves buzzed through the air. A small group of us, Betty, Tom, Sarah, and a few others, arrived early, determined to present a united front. When Marcia walked in, flanked by Greg and the rest of her team, she looked less confident than usual. Maybe it was the sheer number of us, or maybe she sensed the tide was turning. I opened the discussion, explaining our position clearly and respectfully. "This isn't about rebellion," I said. "It's about finding solutions that work for everyone. Our current policy doesn't reflect the reality of living in a desert. It's wasteful, expensive, and unnecessary." Marcia tried to interrupt, but Betty cut her off. "And let's not forget the fines," she added sharply. "People are being punished for something they can't control. That's not fair." Tom chimed in next, his deep voice commanding attention. "You keep talking about property values, but what about quality of life? Nobody moved here because they wanted fake green lawns. They came for the desert, the open spaces, the natural beauty. Why not celebrate that instead of fighting it?" For once, Marcia didn't have a quick comeback. She glanced at Greg, then at the other board members, her confidence visibly wavering. Finally, she sighed and said, "We'll consider your suggestions, but don't expect immediate changes." It wasn't a victory, but it was progress. As we left the meeting, I felt a surge of hope. The HOA might still cling to its outdated policies, but cracks were starting to form in their armor. And with each signature on that petition, with each voice raised in protest, those cracks grew wider. For the first time since moving to Cactus Ridge Estates, I felt like I belonged, not because I fit in, but because I was helping to create a place where everyone could thrive. The days following the emergency meeting were tense. Marcia's vague promise to consider our suggestions didn't fill me with confidence. Experience had taught us that the HOA rarely budged on anything without significant pressure. So while we waited for their response, we decided to keep the momentum going. Word of our petition spread quickly through the neighborhood. People who hadn't signed before approached us, asking how they could help. Some even admitted they'd been too afraid to speak up earlier, but now felt emboldened by the growing movement. It was heartening to see so many neighbors stepping out of the shadows, ready to challenge the status quo. But not everyone was supportive. A handful of residents sided with the HOA, arguing that strict rules were necessary to maintain order and protect property values. One afternoon, as I watered my potted plants on the porch, Mrs. Henderson from across the street marched over, her lips pursed in disapproval. "You're causing trouble," she said sharply. "Rules are there for a reason. If everyone starts doing whatever they want, this place will fall apart." I set down the watering can and faced her, keeping my tone calm but firm. "Mrs. Henderson, no one's trying to tear the neighborhood apart. We just want rules that make sense for the environment, for our wallets, and for our sanity. Isn't it better to work together than force people into something that doesn't fit?" She huffed and walked away, muttering under her breath, but I noticed she didn't meet my eyes. Deep down, I think she knew I had a point. Meanwhile, Betty discovered something that gave our cause even more weight: an email chain between Marcia and the board members discussing potential legal action against me if I refused to pay the $250 fine. Someone, a secret ally within the HOA, had slipped her the information. Armed with this evidence, we filed a formal complaint with the local housing authority, accusing the HOA of harassment and unreasonable enforcement of its policies. Things escalated quickly after that. The HOA called another meeting, this time packed with homeowners eager to voice their opinions. The room buzzed with tension as Marcia took her seat at the head of the table, her usual composure replaced by thinly veiled irritation. When she announced the agenda item about my non-compliance, I stood up, clutching copies of the signed petition and the leaked emails. "This isn't just about me," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "It's about fairness and common sense. Forcing people to maintain grass in a desert is wasteful, impractical, and frankly, ridiculous." To my surprise, murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Neighbors began speaking up, sharing their frustrations with the HOA's rigid rules. Tom recounted his absurd fine for a dead patch, while Sarah talked about the stress of constantly worrying about inspections. Even Mr. Alvarez, usually quiet and reserved, chimed in, saying he'd spent hundreds trying to grow grass only to watch it die within weeks. Marcia tried to regain control, insisting that the rules existed to preserve the community's integrity. But her arguments fell flat when Betty held up the leaked emails, revealing the HOA's threat of legal action. The room erupted into chaos. Voices rose, accusations flew, and for the first time, I saw cracks in Marcia's carefully constructed facade. By the end of the meeting, the board reluctantly agreed to suspend all pending fines related to the grass policy and revisit the rule entirely. It wasn't a complete victory. We still had to wait for the official revision, but it was a monumental step forward. As I left the community center that night, surrounded by smiling neighbors and heartfelt thanks, I realized something important. Sometimes change starts small. One person standing up can inspire others to do the same. And together, we could transform even the most stubborn systems, one blade of non-existent grass at a time. Months later, life in Cactus Ridge Estates feels like a completely different story. The HOA's iron grip has loosened considerably, and while it still exists, its power is no longer absolute. After weeks of heated discussions, revised proposals, and compromises, the board finally agreed to replace the infamous grass-cutting mandate with a new guideline encouraging xeriscaping, landscaping that works with the desert instead of against it. For me, this change was more than just a win. It was validation. My barren yard, once considered a problem, became an example of what the HOA now promoted: sustainable, low maintenance, and environmentally friendly design. Neighbors started swapping tips on drought-resistant plants and creative ways to decorate their yards with rocks, cacti, and native shrubs. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to reflect the beauty of the desert we all loved. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional. People who had once kept to themselves now wave hello as they pass by. Conversations flow freely at the community mailbox or during evening walks. Even Mrs. Henderson softened over time, eventually inviting me over for coffee one afternoon. She didn't apologize for her earlier criticism, but she did admit that my little rebellion, her words, had sparked some much-needed change. As for Marcia, well, let's just say her reign came to an end. At the next annual election, a group of residents, including Betty, Tom, and Sarah, ran for positions on the HOA board and won by a landslide. They promised transparency, fairness, and policies that actually made sense for our unique environment. Watching Marcia hand over her clipboard and neatly pressed blazer felt like the closing chapter of a long, exhausting battle. Now, when I step outside onto my porch, I feel a deep sense of pride. Sure, my yard isn't perfect. It never will be. But it's authentic. It belongs here, just like I do. And thanks to everything that happened, I found a renewed appreciation for community, not the kind enforced by rules and fines, but the kind built on trust, cooperation, and shared values. I've also gained something unexpected: respect. Neighbors often stop by to ask for advice on dealing with the HOA or share updates on their own landscaping projects. Betty jokes that I'm the unofficial desert guru, though I think she deserves most of the credit. Without her determination and insider knowledge, we might not have uncovered the emails that turned the tide in our favor. Even Greg, the lawn inspector, seems different these days. He traded his clipboard for gardening gloves and joined a local conservation group focused on preserving Arizona's natural habitats. Last week, he stopped by my house to compliment my newly planted agave garden. "Looks good," he said with a sheepish grin before driving off in his golf cart. Coming from him, that was high praise indeed. Looking back, I realize how much I've grown since moving to Cactus Ridge Estates. What started as frustration over a ridiculous rule turned into a journey of self-discovery and empowerment. Standing up to the HOA taught me that even the smallest voices can make a difference if they're willing to speak up and stick together. Life here isn't perfect, but it's real. And sometimes, that's the best thing you can hope for. As the sun sets over the horizon, casting golden light across the rugged landscape, I smile knowing that I helped shape this place into something better. For myself, for my neighbors, and for anyone else brave enough to call the desert home.